Picture this. It is 1919. The dust is settling on a remote, sun-baked hilltop overlooking the Pacific Ocean in central California. There are no roads here, no water, no electricity, just 250,000 acres of empty ranch land and a view that stretches to infinity. And standing on this hill is a man who has just inherited a fortune and a woman who is about to make history. The man is William Randolph Hearst. The woman is Julia Morgan. And what they are about to start will become the most obsessive, expensive, and controversial construction project in American history. A house. But calling Simeon a house is like calling the Titanic a boat. 165 rooms, 127 acres of terraced gardens, a private zoo with zebras and polar bears, 2 massive swimming pools that look like they were stolen from the Roman Empire. And it was built in a place so isolated that every single bag of cement, every crate of art, every steel beam had to be hauled up a 5-mile dirt track that turned into a mudslide when it rained. Let the scale of this sink in for a moment. Most mansions are built in a few years. This one took 28 years to build. 28 years of constant hammering, drilling, and pouring concrete. And here's the kicker. It was never actually finished. We are talking about a residence that had 41 fireplaces, 58 bedrooms, 60 bathrooms, a movie theater, an airfield. It consumed the lives of hundreds of workers and the fortunes of one of the richest men in the world. But why? Why would a media tycoon who owned apartments in New York and castles in Wales choose this desolate hill to build his masterpiece? And how did a tiny woman, standing just 5 feet tall, engineer a concrete fortress that could survive massive earthquakes when most men thought it was impossible? To answer these questions, we have to look past the gold leaf and the marble statues. We have to look at the madness of the man who dreamed it and the genius of the woman who built it, the tycoon and the architect. William Randolph Hearst was not a quiet man. Unlike George Vanderbilt, who built Biltmore to retreat from the world, Hearst built San Simeon to rule it. He was the king of yellow journalism, the inspiration for Citizen Kane, a man who controlled the news for millions of Americans. He was loud, imposing, and used to getting exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted was to return to the hill he loved as a child. He called it La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. When he walked into Julia Morgan's office in San Francisco in 1919, he told her, "I would like to build a little something." A little something, Julia Morgan, was an anomaly. In 1919, architecture was a man's world. But Morgan was the first woman ever admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She was an engineer as much as an artist. She understood reinforced concrete. She understood seismic shifts, and she was the only person who could handle Hearst's volatile temperament. Together, they embarked on a project that defied logic. The location was the first nightmare. The nearest train depot was miles away. To get materials to the site, they had to build a pier into the ocean to receive shipments by boat. Then they had to build a road up the mountain. And the materials? Hearst wasn't just buying lumber and brick. He was buying history. He would travel to Europe, walk into a monastery in Spain, point to a 15th century carved ceiling and say, "I'll take it." The ceiling would be dismantled, crated, shipped across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, to San Francisco, then down to San Simeon, and finally hauled up the mountain to be reassembled like a giant jigsaw puzzle. There were ancient Roman sarcophagi, Egyptian statues from the 18th dynasty, medieval tapestries. The collection was so vast that Julia Morgan had to design rooms specifically to fit the art Hearst kept buying. Usually, an architect designs a room and then you furnish it. At San Simeon, the furniture arrived first, and Morgan had to build a castle around it. The main house, known as Casa Grande, was designed to look like a Spanish cathedral. It rises like a phantom out of the coastal fog. The twin towers reach 137 feet into the sky, and unlike the wooden mansions of the East Coast, this was built of steel and reinforced concrete. Hearst was terrified of fire, and Morgan was terrified of earthquakes. The result is a fortress disguised as a palace. The construction site was a city in itself. Workers lived in a tent camp on the mountain. There were Swiss wood carvers, Italian stone masons, plaster experts. Hearst paid them well, but the conditions were brutal. The wind on the hill could blow a man off a scaffold. The summer heat was relentless, and Hearst was constantly changing his mind. He would walk onto the site, look at a fireplace that had just been installed, and say, "Move it to the other wall," and Morgan would have to order the demolition and reconstruction. A swimming pool was built, then rebuilt, then enlarged, then rebuilt again. The Neptune pool alone was redesigned 3 times over 12 years. Let's talk about that pool. The Neptune pool. You have probably seen photos of it. It hangs on the edge of the mountain, looking out over the ocean. It holds 345,000 gallons of water. It features an ancient Roman temple facade that Hearst imported from Europe. The colonnades are genuine marble. It is perhaps the most famous swimming pool on Earth. But the indoor pool, the Roman pool, is even more insane. It looks like an ancient bathhouse. The walls are covered in glass tiles, but not just glass. Inside each tile is a layer of 22-karat gold. There are over 1 million of these tiles. The room shimmers in blue and gold, a silent underwater cathedral that costs millions. By the mid-1920s, the castle was functional, even if it wasn't finished, and the guests began to arrive. This is where the story shifts from construction to spectacle. An invitation to San Simeon was the golden ticket of the 1920s and 30s. Guests would arrive by private train to a station miles away, then be driven up the winding road. As they ascended, they would pass through Hearst's private zoo. Imagine driving up a dirt road in California and seeing a herd of zebras grazing, or kangaroos hopping across the path. Hearst had the largest private zoo in the world. He had lions, tigers, bears, exotic antelope. Most were kept in enclosures, but the herbivores roamed free. When the guests reached the top, they entered a world that didn't follow the rules of reality. Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, Winston Churchill, George Bernard Shaw. The guest list was a who's who of history. But despite the opulence, life at the castle was strangely regulated. Hearst didn't drink, and he hated drunks. Guests were allowed 1 cocktail before dinner, and that was it. If you smuggled liquor into your room, you were packed and sent home the next morning. Dinner was served in the refectory, a room with a 400-year-old ceiling and silk flags from Siena. But on the long tables, amidst the silver candlesticks and antique china, sat bottles of ketchup and mustard, paper napkins. Hearst wanted it to feel like a ranch. He called this massive castle the ranch. It was a bizarre mix of unimaginable wealth and casual camping. Every night, there was a movie. Hearst owned a movie studio, so they watched films that hadn't even been released yet. The theater was plush, red velvet, with caryatids supporting the walls. For nearly 2 decades, the construction never stopped. The hammers were the soundtrack of life at San Simeon. Julia Morgan was constantly designing new wings, new guest houses, new animal enclosures. The cost was astronomical. In today's money, Hearst spent hundreds of millions of dollars. But trees do not grow to the sky, and neither do fortunes. The Great Depression hit in 1929, but for Hearst, the party continued for a few more years. He was leveraged, borrowing against his empire to fund his obsession. But by 1937, the house of cards began to wobble. Hearst was 74 years old. He owed $126 million. His creditors stepped in. They seized control of his finances. They stopped the construction. For the first time in 18 years, the hill went silent. It was a humiliation for the Titan. He was put on an allowance. He had to sell off some of his animals. The construction crews were sent home. The castle stood there, 90% complete, a monument to an ambition that finally ran out of cash. Hearst managed to keep the castle, but the dream was fractured. He lived there for another 10 years, but his health was failing. In 1947, at the age of 84, his heart began to give out. His doctors told him he had to leave the remote hill and move to the city, closer to medical care. Leaving San Simeon was the hardest thing he ever did. As he was driven down that winding road for the last time, legend says he wept. He had spent nearly 30 years building a fantasy, and now he was leaving it unfinished. He died 4 years later, in 1951. But the story of the castle didn't end with his death. In fact, its second life was just beginning. The Hearst Corporation didn't know what to do with it. It was too expensive to maintain. It was in the middle of nowhere. Who would want a 165-room white elephant on a drought-stricken hill? They tried to donate it to the University of California. The university said no, too expensive. Finally, in 1958, the Hearst family donated the castle to the state of California. It became a state historical monument. And then the tourists came. Just like at Biltmore, the public was fascinated. They drove up Highway 1 in the millions. They wanted to see the gold pool. They wanted to see the zebras, some of which are still out there, descendants of the original herd, roaming the hills today. Today, Hearst Castle is one of the most visited state parks in California. It stands as a complex legacy. It is a symbol of American excess, yes, but it is also a masterpiece of architecture. Julia Morgan, the quiet genius behind the loud tycoon, is finally getting her due. We now understand that the castle isn't just a rich man's toy. It is an engineering marvel. The concrete structure she designed has survived earthquakes that leveled other buildings. The water systems she engineered still function. When you walk through the Casa Grande today, you feel the ghostly presence of the 1920s. The ketchup bottles are gone, but the tapestries are still there. The Neptune pool has been restored, shimmering blue against the white marble. It remains a paradox, a European castle in the American West, a home built for a crowd, now visited by strangers, a project that ate a fortune and was never finished. Hearst Castle, like Biltmore, proves that while money can buy stone and marble, it is vision that creates immortality. William Randolph Hearst and Julia Morgan created something that shouldn't exist, and yet there it sits, high on the enchanted hill, watching the fog roll in off the Pacific, waiting for a master who will never return. So next time you are driving down the California coast, look up. You might just see the sun glinting off a gold tower, a reminder of a time when one man tried to build Olympus on a cattle ranch.